Today I'm going to talk about the signal to noise ratio in photography and how it can help you get better photographs. When taking a photograph, you need to get a good exposure. And to get a good exposure, you need to get as much light into your camera as you can without overexposing the shot and blowing out those highlights. There are some exceptions to this, but in general, the more light you let into your camera without blowing out those highlights, the better the signal you will have for the camera to build that image. However, there is a little bit more to it than this, and the signal to noise ratio is a really good thing to understand to really have an idea of what the camera is doing and how to get the best results from it. So we need to understand each component of the signal to noise ratio. So that's the signal, the noise, and the ratio. Noise is a slight variation in the color and luminance between pixels in your photograph. The greater the variation, the more it becomes visible as texture. When you get a lot of variation in the color, you'll tend to see greens and reds in your solid colors. And when you just get a variance in luminance, it gives the look of a texture in those solid colors. There are three different ways noise is generated. First of all, you have your background noise. This is the noise that will be there in every single photograph you take. To see this, take a photograph with the lens cap on. Bring it into your editing program and then bring up the exposure by sliding that exposure all the way to the right. This will vary from camera to camera, but you can see on my camera how much it produces, and this is pretty standard for digital cameras nowadays. Next we have high ISO noise, and this can be seen the same way, but by cranking up the ISO on your camera, taking a photograph with the lens cap on again, and then looking at it in your editing program. This will be a combination of the background noise and the high ISO noise, but the high ISO noise will be the difference between the two. Here they are side by side. I've got the first one with just the background noise in with a low ISO, and then I've got the second one with that high ISO. And you can see that extra noise produced when you use a really high ISO. Third of all, we have long exposure noise. This tends to get worse with hotter climates, so I'm guessing it's a byproduct of heat building up in the sensor. Obviously, not all pixels will be the same across your sensor, and some react a little worse than others to heat. The ones that don't do so well will sometimes give you a red, a green, or a blue pixel, and the longer you leave your shutter open for, the bigger they seem to get. This isn't so important unless you're doing exposures of a minute or longer. So the hotter the climate and the longer the exposure, the more of this long exposure noise you'll see. I did a video on long exposure noise a while ago, so if you haven't seen that yet and want to learn more about it, click on the eye in the corner or the link in the description. Noise tends to be more visible in what would be a single colored area of your photograph. So if you're taking a photo of a blue sky or a white or painted wall, any noise will be more visible in those areas. On the other hand, if you're taking a photograph of a dense forest or a textured surface where there is a lot of detail and texture, the noise will be less obvious in those photographs or in the parts of those photographs where all of this detail is. Also, in the shadows of an image or where the background might be blurred out and give you a more even color, where there is less detail, the noise will be more obvious again. Next, you need to know what the signal is. This is basically the light being let into your camera. This is what you want, and the more you get of it, the better. As I've already said, as long as you don't overexpose and blow out your highlights. Let's say you're taking a photograph with settings of f8, 1/200th of a second, and ISO 100, and you get a good exposure. You might return to the scene later on when it's a little bit darker, and to get the same exposure with f8 and 1/200th of a second, you might have to bump up your ISO. Let's say it gets so dark that you have to bump it up to 6400. So there is less light about, and you need to open up the camera by 6 stops to get the same exposure. Now your camera actually isn't letting in any more light. All it's doing is amplifying the signal from the sensor. So there's a lot less light. The ISO is amplifying that signal, and when it amplifies that signal, it adds noise. And this is just basically interference. It's a little bit like an old school analog TV when you're trying to get a signal, and you're tuning it in, but you're a little bit far away. The TV has to amplify that signal, and there'll be a lot of grain and noise on the TV screen. If you're a little bit young for old school analog TVs, just do a little bit of research in it online. But basically, if you'd have to bump your ISO from 100 to 6400, this would mean the signal would be 64 times weaker than the first exposure, where there was more available light. And this brings us on to the signal to noise ratio. So just in case you don't understand ratios, basically with a ratio of 1:1, this means there is the same amount of both elements. And in photography, if you have a signal to noise ratio of 1:1, it would be a ridiculously noisy image. Whereas if you say had a 5:1 ratio, this would be much better and there would be much more signal, basically 5 times more signal than the noise. So you've got 5 times of the good stuff, which is the signal, compared to 1 bit of the noise, which is the bad stuff. So when I say a high signal to noise ratio, I mean an image with a good exposure and low noise. And when I say a low signal to noise ratio, I mean an image with a lot of noise. Now I know there's a lot of information here, and you may have to watch the video a couple of times. I'll also make a page on my website where I'll have all of this written down, so you'll have extra data there. That link will be in the description. So to recap, the signal is the data you are collecting to make up your photograph, and the noise is the interference created when collecting this data. Now there is plenty of geeky stuff you can go away and research on signal to noise ratio online, and there's lots of maths behind it. But I'm going to stay in the layman's terms here to make it as easy as possible for you to understand. Now if there are any engineers watching out there, I do apologize if I mess it up or I pronounce something wrong or it just doesn't sound right. But I'm getting my head around it, and this is how I understand it, and I'm just passing this on to you guys, just to make it easier for you to understand how your camera works and how you can take a better photograph. Because that's ultimately what we want to do. We want to get the best out of our cameras and get a really good image that we can do the most with when it's on our computer. The first thing you could do is open up your aperture to let more light in. This will increase the signal without increasing the noise. But we all know that lenses with wider apertures get expensive really quickly. If you decrease the shutter speed, this will also help. But if you decrease it too much and you're shooting handheld, you'll be limited by how long you can make that exposure before you get motion blur from the movement of your hands. If, however, you're on a tripod and your subject is static, you can increase your exposure time a lot more. But not too much, otherwise you'll start to get that long exposure noise. The next thing you can do to decrease that noise is by dropping your ISO. And this will reduce the amount of high ISO noise compared to your signal. But if the shot then becomes so underexposed that you have to really bring it back when you're editing, this will mean you'll start off with a much weaker signal, and as you increase the exposure in your editing program, you'll also bring up the background noise, pushing your image closer to that 1:1 ratio. So you can only really drop your ISO when there is enough light about to do so. As you can see, it's a little bit of a juggling act to get a good signal to noise ratio, and it comes down to good execution of your principal settings. These are aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. And as well as all of that, you need to think about how much detail and texture is in your image. If it's a solid color, let's say just after sunset in the blue hour with a pretty boring cloudless sky, you really need to keep your ISO levels down because noise really shows itself in solid or uniform colors. In this instance, it would be worth shooting from a tripod and increasing your exposure time to increase the signal. Now, noise also hides in the darker areas, so in getting a longer exposure, if you still have darker areas in your shot and you can't increase the signal anymore by just opening the aperture or increasing your exposure time because the highlights will start to blow out and you'll start losing detail in those highlights, it might be worth bracketing your shots. This basically means you'll take separate shots for your highlights, your mids, and your shadows. This is a slightly more complex technique, and I've done a video on it, So click on the eye in the corner or the link in the description if you haven't seen this video yet. This will basically give you more signal data in your shadows that you can blend into your final shot. And as I've already said, that's a little bit more of a complex technique, but if you understand how the signal to noise ratio works, you can kind of understand how blending shots and how bracketing shots works as well. If your image has a lot of detail in it, you'll be able to push the ISOs much higher before starting to see that noise. Also, if you have a subject with all of that detail, but it's quite small in your frame, and then it's surrounded by more uniform colors, try getting closer to the subject. If you fill the frame with that detail, losing any of those sort of plain areas around the subject, this will mean that you'll have less areas that will show that noise, which could be more distracting for the viewer. So how much noise you can tolerate is a mixture of exposure levels, personal preference, composition, and the detail and texture of the subject or the scene that you're photographing. It also depends on what camera you have, how old it is, and how high you can push your ISO before the noise becomes too much. With the Sony a7 III, which is what I'm using today, I can comfortably push this up to around about 12,800 before worrying too much when I get a good exposure of a detailed subject or scene. However, with an older camera like the GH4, I can't push the ISOs up as much as this. It's an older camera, it's older technology, and even though it still takes really good images, I need to get that signal up and that noise down. So get a higher signal to noise ratio to get a much better image. If there are some solid colors in the scene and the light is dropping, I'll change my settings or composition accordingly. As I raise my ISO levels, I look for more detailed or more textured subjects to photograph, or I might start shooting from a tripod. Another thing to take into consideration is how you are shooting the subject. If you're shooting handheld, you'll be restricted with your shutter speed, so there will come a point where you'll have to increase the ISO to get a good exposure because you've come to your lowest usable shutter speed. But it's better to get a slightly noisier image than a blurry, unusable image. Now, if that all wasn't enough, on top of this is the ISO invariance of the sensor, which means that the camera can boost the ISO just like the program would in the simplest terms. There is a little bit more to it than this, but I've covered this in a previous video. So if you want to learn more about that, click on the eye in the corner or the link in the description. Basically, cameras with an ISO invariant sensor will cope much better being underexposed than ones with a non-ISO invariant sensor. If your camera is a Sony or a Nikon, and I think Fuji as well, as you boost an underexposed shot, it won't bring up the background noise as much as, say, the Signal. Unfortunately, this isn't the case on Canon cameras. They have non-ISO invariant sensors. So as you boost an image from a Canon camera that's severely underexposed, it'll really boost that background noise, making it almost unusable. Again, there is a lot on this online, so if you want to find out more, just search for ISO invariant sensors. I'm not going to go into too much detail about it today, and I've kind of covered what I need to. And now there is one other thing. If you take a shot with a really high ISO and it looks okay, but you need to crop into it to make the framing or to make the composition better, this will actually magnify the noise in your shot, and it will become more and more obvious. So zooming in optically when taking the shot is preferable over cropping in post. So again, this comes down to the basics in photography, getting the right composition and getting it right in camera. Now here are a few test shots I've taken to show you what I mean. You've seen some of them already, but I'll talk through exactly what's going on in each shot. With this first image, it's got a good signal to noise ratio. So I got a good exposure in the camera. My highlights are bunched up to the right hand side of the histogram, but they're not blown out. If I hold down Option or Alt and I click on whites and I drag it at all, you can see my highlights in the sky aren't blown out. There's a tiny little bit in the middle that is blown out, but I'm guessing this is probably a shiny surface. So if I bring my whites up, you can see they start to blow out, but I've just about protected my highlights in this image. So if there were clouds in the sky, you would see a lot of detail there in bringing the highlights down in Lightroom. So there's no high ISO noise because it's at ISO 100. As the signal is good, that background noise is there, but it's really low and it's completely hidden in the image. As for long exposure noise, this one was shot at 1/200th of a second, so we don't have any long exposure noise either. With this next one, I purposely underexposed it. I've got ISO 100, f8, and at 1/200th of a second. So this one has a low signal to noise ratio. I didn't capture much light, so that means the signal is low. If I was to boost this up, say 5 stops, and then zoom in, you can see in the shadows, if I bring those up as well, there's lots of noise. So even though it's at ISO 100, there is lots of noise in there. And this is background noise. In the brighter parts of the image, it's harder to see this noise, but in the darker parts, you can really see all of this background noise. With this third image, I got a good exposure, but I did have my ISO at 6400. So you'd expect noise in this image with such a high ISO. If I zoom in, it's actually quite a clean image because I got a good exposure. These towers are a little bit dark, but the camera handles it really well. So if I compare this third image to the second image that we've just gone over, this one has ISO at 100. Remember, this was the one I underexposed by 5 stops. When I've brought it back up, the noise is actually worse in this one than the one that I exposed properly at ISO 6400. So it shows you can push your ISOs up to get a good exposure and actually get a cleaner image. If we look down the bottom at the shadows, again, this is the image with ISO 100, and this is the image with ISO 6400. If I just bring the shadows up on that. The one at ISO 6400, again, in the shadows, is cleaner than the one that was underexposed by 5 stops. Now I am pushing them around and I'm taking them to extremes, but in taking them to extremes, you can show what's going on and you can learn a lot about how your camera works with a signal to noise ratio. Now if we move on to the fourth image, this is what I mean by blowing out your highlights. You can see the histogram is pushed all of the way to the right-hand side. All of this white area in the sky is crushed up to the right-hand side of the histogram. If I hold down my Option or Alt button and then right-click on the white and move it a little bit, you can see that sky to the left-hand side is blown out. So if there were clouds in the sky, you wouldn't see them up here because it's lost all detail and I've overexposed the image. So you need to avoid overexposing your image. You can push that signal up as much as you can, but don't push it past that point where you start losing details in your image. With this next image, I went down to the marina. There's a lot of detail in these buildings, and this is what I want to focus on. With this image, again, it's a good signal to noise ratio. So the signal is high, or the exposure is good, and there's not much noise at all in the image. And you can see this on the histogram. I haven't blown out my highlights. It's sitting in the middle and there's a good spread. There are quite a few bright bits in the image, which is showing on the histogram here. With this sixth image that I took, I purposely underexposed it again. This one is underexposed by 5 stops. But you can see in these details, there is a little bit of noise when I go to 1:1, but if I zoom out, it's surprisingly clean. On this next one, I've pushed it even further. So this is, I think, 8 stops under. So I'll just bring it back over using the adjustment brush. I'll reset those. Bring the exposure up by 2 stops or so. Done. So with the adjustment brush, I brought it up 2 stops. And with the exposure slider, I brought it up 5 stops. So that's 7 stops. You can really see that background noise. It also shows the vignetting of the lens. But I've just, again, pushed this image to an extreme to first of all show you actually how good the sensors can be nowadays, but also how when you have a low signal, when you bring it back up, it also brings up that background signal. And that's the noise you see here With image number 8, I've cropped into the buildings on the right hand side. Because of all of this detail, I can actually shoot at ISO 12,800. You can't actually see that noise too much. If I zoom in 1:1, you can see a little bit of noise, but it does surprisingly well. And all of this detail is hiding all of this noise really well. If I just bring up the contrast a little bit, and maybe do that a bit. Oh, got clarity on already. So if I reduce the clarity even more, it actually cleans up the image really well. Could probably go a bit more with the contrast, but that is a really usable image. Again, if you zoom in 1:1, you can just see a little bit of noise, but with noise reduction tools, you could get rid of that very easily. And this is at ISO 12,800. And the same with this image. Again, I shot this at 12,800 and it's of the water. So there's lots of ripples and lots of detail in that image. I crop in, and on the solid colors, you can really see the noise. But in all of this detail, it's harder to see the noise. Now on this next one, I pushed it even further. I'm at 51,200 ISO. Now the noise is coming through and you can really see it in the darker areas of your image. But again, I've bumped up the contrast, brought down the shadows. Probably if I played around with the clarity a little bit, and then maybe messed around with the noise reduction a little bit more. Again, as a whole image, that's very usable. But it's a surprisingly clean image with an ISO of 51,200. That detail is really hiding the noise. Now, if I shoot at a slightly lower ISO, 32,000, I point it up to the sky. This is a solid color. Even when you're zoomed out, you can see that noise pattern as texture and color in the sky. And this is obviously high ISO noise. So if I zoom in, you can see the differences in the colors and the differences in the luminance between the pixel sites. Now, image number 12 is an example of how an ISO invariant sensor works. If I bring up the exposure by 5 stops, there is a little bit of noise, but not too much. Now, if I compare this to the next one, this is a shot taken at ISO 5000 with a good exposure. Whereas this one is ISO 100 with a bad exposure. Remember, I underexposed it purposely by 5 stops. So if I bring it up, those exposures are quite similar. Might have to bring this one down a touch more so they match. Yeah, that's about right. So I'm going to zoom in up on the top of these buildings here. Now this is the one with ISO 5000. And this is the underexposed one with ISO 100. The noise is very similar, but it's actually cleaner with the image with 5000 ISO. So even though you might have a camera like the A7 III with an ISO invariant sensor, it's sometimes better to bump the ISO up and get a good exposure by using your aperture, your shutter speed, and your ISO rather than underexposing it and fixing it in post. But it's good to test your camera and push it to its limits so you know where they are. So when you go to shoot images, or you go to a shoot, or you run an event when you take photos, you're going to know exactly where those limits are. So I know that's a ton of information, but watch it a couple of times, and once you understand this, you'll really be able to understand your camera much more, and then you'll be able to start building much better photographs. But just to kind of sum it all up, if there is a lot of detail in your shot, you can get away with much higher ISOs in your images. If there are a lot of uniform colors, you'll have to keep the ISO as low as possible, ideally getting the camera on a tripod if there isn't much light about, and if your subject isn't moving too much. If your composition includes a lot of uniform colors or dark areas around the subject, consider zooming in on the subject while you're taking the photograph. So I don't mean cropping in, I mean optically zooming in. Then you'll get rid of those large areas where the noise will really sort of rear up and show its ugly head. If you're shooting really long exposures of say 4 minutes or more in a hot country, you will need to use long exposure noise reduction or remove it when editing. If you badly underexpose your image with a non-ISO invariant sensor, like the Canons, you're a bit screwed. So it would be better to shoot with a higher ISO and get some high ISO noise over mixing the signal with the background noise. And the last thing to think about is the shadows in your frame. If they're quite dark, there'll be a lot less signal in those areas. And when you bring them into your editing program and you slide the shadow slider to the right, you'll not only amplify the shadows, but you'll amplify that background signal as well. And this is why a lot of times when you boost your shadows, they'll get a little bit noisy. Like I said earlier, to overcome this, you can bracket your shots, and this just means normally taking 3 exposures, one for the highlights, one for the midtones, and one for the shadows. Then when blended together, the image will have much more detail in the shadows, as well as not blowing out the highlights. Just be careful though when using this technique, as it's really easy to go overboard with the editing and get that kind of old school HDR look to your images. Be conservative when you're editing, but know that if you bracket your shots when there's a huge dynamic range in the frame, that you'll be able to bring those details back and there'll be a much stronger signal in the shadows. This video was spurred on by Joe Harris's post on my Learn Photography Now Facebook page about getting good shots with high ISOs. I know some of you don't like Facebook, and that's fine. But for those of you that haven't signed up yet and are okay with Facebook, head over there now and sign up and get involved in all of the different conversations. And if you want to find Joe's post on shooting with high ISOs, which is really interesting, under topics, search for noise, and this will take you straight to Joe's post. It's interesting, and he's got some great examples of what I've covered here. So thanks Joe for spending the time on putting that post together. It's much appreciated. Now, if you want to learn more about ISO invariance, click on this next video here. And for 4 ways to remove long exposure noise in your images, click on this video down here. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe for weekly tutorials in photography every Monday and Thursday. I'll see you next time.